Good morning, fourth graders. Today we're going to continue looking at some more primary and secondary source documents so that we can analyze these documents to see how the Spanish missions impacted the economy and the environment of California. So yesterday we looked at a drawing of the way that the California Indians dressed. And from that drawing, I wanted you to draw from what you saw, the details in the actual drawing, to see what did they use to dress themselves. So they used a lot of the natural environment, the animals that were there. We learned that if they lived near the coast, they did a lot of fishing. If they lived in the mountains, they had to have deerskin capes, or maybe like a feathered cape because it is colder in the mountains at night. So we saw that they used the environment to help them survive. We also learned from two sources that burning of the land was a tradition of the California Indians, primarily to help them grow certain plants that they needed in order to survive in the region that they lived. It was also a way for them to catch certain animals like rabbits, to smoke them out, so it was easier for them to hunt them. So today we're going to continue our journey, and we're going to be looking at two sources today. And I'm going to share the document so you remember where to find it. So remember, we are going to Schoology. You are going to find the document that is Social Studies 4.2a. When you click on that document, it's the same one you used yesterday. So you're going to just go to day 2, which is April 21st. So here we're going to be looking at the view of Monterey. And it's a presidio that is a fort. So presidio in Spanish means fort. And this is where the soldiers were to protect the missions, okay? The second source we're going to look at is Pablo Tac's writings, and that was written in 1840. So Pablo Tac was a California Indian who was born in Mission San Luis Rey, which is in northern San Diego County. So he was a Luceño man. So we're going to find out more about the way these missions impacted the environment and the economy of California through these two sources. So for the first source, the question we want to answer is, what can this image tell us about the impact of European animals on California? Number 2, what do you notice about the grasses in the raised hill where the sheep graze in the front left-hand side of the drawing? Okay, so again, to access the actual document or the source is you just need to click on that link and it'll take you directly to that source. So here is the picture. Let me make it bigger so we can see it. Okay, so here's this picture. Now, when the Spanish came to California, they of course built the missions. And around the mission, they built a presidio. So you'll see the presidio in the background there. It's a fort to protect it from invaders or people who try to take over. In the foreground, you will see, it looks like native people here on this hill. This is what the question was referring to. And not really sure who this is, but to me, could be a Spanish person. It's not dressed like a priest, so maybe it's a soldier. And in the background, you see these animals grazing right here. You also see more California Indians here that are doing some work or labor. And then you also see some native women right here too that are hanging the laundry up. So just some background on this specific picture here. So when the Spanish came to California, they brought animals with them. And as you can see, the animals are grazing in the grasses there. They're eating plants. And we know that plants were an important part of the diet of the California Indians. And when these European animals came, what ended up happening is that they were competing for the same plants and grasses and roots that the native people were using and eating. So this meant that some of these animals were also competing for animals that they also hunted, like the deer. What ended up happening is that because of this fierce competition, right, it's when you have to compete for food, it creates a problem because it means that the supply is limited, and right, the whoever gets it first is the one that's going to survive. In this case, a lot of California Indians ended up going hungry. They were malnourished, so they weren't getting the correct vitamins and minerals that they needed in their diet because these animals, these livestock, were eating up the plants that they relied on. And they actually starved. So they were starving because their natural food, the food that they accessed for many years, was now getting eaten by these animals that came from Europe. So here we have a competition for food. And then they also, as we learned in the last inquiry, is that because of the European people coming to California, they were not equipped to deal with the diseases that the Europeans had in Europe. So with starvation of their lack of their natural foods, and them starving, and with the epidemics of diseases that killed their village communities, some Native people had no choice and had to move to the missions to rebuild their communities because they needed to find a more stable food supply. Some missions had a difficult time supporting the Native populations and allowed Native people to live outside the missions too. In some missions, Native people ate some new foods such as wheat, barley, and beef while supplementing their diet with traditional foods. Okay. So let's go back to the question. What can this image tell us about the impact of the European animals on California? So what started to happen? And you can also read this little blurb right here to help you. And what do you notice about the grasses on the raised hill where the sheep graze? So what do you notice about the grasses there? And then tell me and write down what you see. The second source we're going to look at is Pablo text writing. I'm going to click on that. All right, so what we want to answer for his writing is, what kind of work did the Spanish require the neophytes to do? So remember last time we talked about that word neophytes. That means you are not baptized. So this, when they talk about neophytes, they're talking about the Native people who did not convert to Catholicism. They did not get baptized. So what was the work that they were required to do? And then how is this type of work different from the work that Native people did outside the missions? And how do you think Pablo Tac's life experiences influenced his views on mission life? So remember, Pablo Tac was born in a mission. So he really didn't know much about the Native life prior to him being born. So his experience might have been very different from someone who was already living in an Indian village, living off of the environment. So this says, so the missionary arrived with few people. Then our captain, seeing them from afar, and also the others, became scared, but they did not flee. Or did they take up arms to kill them? But seated, they watched them. But when those men approached, then our captain Then did our captain rise and meet them. The Fernandino speaks to him in Spanish, as in his language. But our captain does not understand him because he had never seen white men. The captain speaks to him, and the Fernandino could not understand him either. The captain somehow asked him what he was seeking here, but through hand signals and in his language. The Fernandino gave him gifts, and so they became friends. The captain, seeing these people so generous, turned to his people and must have spoken favorably of the whites. And that is why the Spaniards were not killed, because that was the day on which God wanted to release us from heathenism. Okay, so that was what Pablo Tack writes for this encounter, talking about his captain, seeing the Fernandino, which are the priests that were at the missions. So again, remember Pablo Tack is a Luiseño man who was born and raised at the Mission San Luis Rey in modern day San Diego. When he was around 12 years old, he and another boy went to a missionary to study the Catholic religion in Mexico City. And later in Europe, while in Rome, Italy, he eventually created a dictionary of the Luiseño language. Okay. He recorded some of his memories of the missions and how they operated. He also described aspects of Luiseño life and culture. In this writing, he recalls how baptized Indian people called neophytes worked to construct the missions. Native people also worked in the fields and ranches to grow food and take care of the livestock needed for food. Tack also described the other ways that Native people worked at the missions. After his training, Tack was supposed to return to California and serve as a priest, but he died from an illness in Rome. Okay. So Pablo Tack was a unique person because he lived in two worlds. He lived in California during the end of the mission era and in Rome. When he lived in Rome from 1834 to 1841, he died of the illness. In this specific part of his writings, he wrote it for the Catholic Church. He's explaining the importance of native laborers to the Spanish economy in California. When you're baptized as a California Indian, the Native people were critical to the development of the agriculture and material goods needed by the Spanish priests, soldiers, and settlers. Native people produced most of the food and goods that the Spanish needed in California. It was often many months or sometimes years between the arrival of ships from Mexico with new supplies. So the majority of the work on the missions was done by the Native people. Meanwhile, the agricultural economy, which is farming, established by the Spanish, came into direct conflict with Native practices. As the Spanish transformed the land, the natural resources around the missions, making traditional practices increasingly difficult. The Spanish expected Native people in the missions to adopt European work habits and to distance themselves from their former ways of work or other habits, even though some missions required that Native people supplement their diet with outside food. So when the Spanish came, they really pushed for the Native people to become baptized. And they wanted them to live on the missions. And once they got them to the missions, they then had them do a lot of the labor. They did all the work for the priests and the soldiers and the settlers that lived there. So essentially, they were forced to take on the traditions of the Spanish. One of those things was they had to learn how to speak Spanish. They were not allowed to speak their native language. And they were not allowed to do their traditional things that they did in their village. So it was really frowned upon for them. So their main job was just to work for the Spanish. Okay, so once you do that, you go back to the question. What kind of work did the Spanish require the neophytes to do? How is this type of work different from the work that Native people did outside the missions? And how do you think Pablo Tac's life experience influenced his views of mission life? Okay. So that's what you're going to do for today, April 21st. Make sure you fill in your document, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye, guys.